Hey, welcome everybody. I'm Katy Wallace. This is the webinar for vitamin D and sun exposure. I'm giving this talk today in coordination with the Willy Street Co-op, where I offer free monthly webinars. The other service that I offer through the Willy Street Co-op is 45-minute private sessions. I do those via Zoom and in person at Willy West. So if you're interested in that, it's a nice community service, and you can enroll in one of those private sessions by contacting me. Before I present today's talk, I should say I'm not a medical doctor, and I'm providing this information for health education reasons only. The next couple of webinars coming up are a couple of new topics that I haven't presented about. In January, on Tuesday, January 24th, I'll be talking about natural ways to help support sleep. And on Tuesday, February 21st at noon, I'll be talking about natural ways to balance the blood pressure. So I hope you can join me for those. So today I'm going to begin by giving you some background information so you understand what vitamin D is and why it's so important for health. And then in the second part of the presentation, I'll talk about how to achieve optimal vitamin D levels and the other benefits of sunlight besides vitamin D, as well as some concerns about our indoor light environment and how that can be detrimental versus getting natural sunlight. So in case you have to leave early, here's the key takeaways. Vitamin D is not only beneficial, it's really critical for optimal health, and I'll share a number of studies that demonstrate this. Vitamin D is harder to make the further away from the equator you are. So if you're in Madison, Wisconsin, like me, it's getting pretty challenging to make vitamin D for half of the year. So this is very important in terms of optimal health as well as disease prevention. There are other benefits to sunlight that exceed just vitamin D alone. So I would discourage someone from just taking a vitamin D pill and thinking they're done. And supplementing can be very helpful, but light exposure is really optimal. So this is where we're headed. So vitamin D is known as the sunshine vitamin, and it's made from a cholesterol-based molecule that's in our skin that absorbs sunlight, specifically the UV end of the spectrum in sunlight. That prompts our body to use this cholesterol-based molecule to make vitamin D. And then the body converts this to a couple of different forms of vitamin D. One is called pre-vitamin D, and then we have a storage vitamin D and a biologically active vitamin D in our bodies. So the light that's absorbed in the outer layer of our skin, the epidermis, is what is making the vitamin D for us. And you can't wash it away. It's very cool. It's going to stay in there. It's going to work for you no matter what. Although there are some other things that are very important for being able to make vitamin D. And if we have time, maybe in the questions at the end, I can talk more about the importance of magnesium and lack of inflammation for helping make vitamin D. So if you have questions, please put them in the chat, and we'll have some time at the end to answer questions or have a discussion. So I'm speaking from Madison, Wisconsin, and we are located at 43 degrees north latitude. And so what this means in terms of our ability to make vitamin D here in the local community and in other areas that are similarly spaced away from the equator is we can't make any vitamin D basically, or any appreciable amounts of vitamin D for a significant part of the year. So even if you go out in the sun right now, you're not going to get enough UV light to make vitamin D. Nobody is. And this is because there's an ozone layer around the Earth in the atmosphere that absorbs most of the UV light coming towards the Earth. And in the winter, we get even less of that sunlight. And so the amount of UV drops even more. So that's why for most of the year, you can't make vitamin D here. This is a calendar that helps demonstrate how our ability to make vitamin D changes throughout the year. So across the top, you see from January to December. So this is the month. And then the colors represent how good it is for making vitamin D. So a blank circle means you can't make any. Yellow circle means you can make a marginal amount. Orange is so-so, and red is awesome. Okay, so during the red months of the year, you can make an optimal amount of vitamin D that's going to be very beneficial. So if we look where we are, like in Madison, Wisconsin, for example, we're at 43 degrees north. So we'd be in this row that I'm outlining with my mouse. So you can see, can't make any vitamin D in January or February, March, April, May, in the spring, you can make a little bit. Not enough for optimal health, but at least you're making some. June, July, and August, though, you know, if you're getting 2 or 3 hours of sun exposure a day, you're going to make optimal amounts of vitamin D. If you're not outside very much, you're probably still not going to make much vitamin D. So you do have to be out in the sun a fair amount to make vitamin D. And then you can see for the rest of the year. So compare us where we are here to people down by the equator. You can see for the majority of the year, if you live on the equator, you can make optimal amounts of vitamin D for most of the year. So we might wonder, what have people done throughout time to help compensate for the lack of vitamin D? And we think that indigenous people and our ancestors ate more vitamin D rich foods to help compensate for the lack of vitamin D available through sun exposure. But if you look at the list of high vitamin D foods that were in the ancestral diet, you'll see these are not very popular in our modern diet. I mean, maybe some people like to eat fatty fish like salmon or mackerel, herring, but a lot of people don't. And a lot of people don't eat liver or blubber. So I think in many ways we are very much lacking natural ways to get vitamin D in the modern day. If you've been trained to put on sunscreen, like an SPF of 30 when you go outside, especially in the warmer months, you're blocking all of your body's ability to make vitamin D. So you're not going to make any vitamin D when you put sunscreen on. So this is kind of at odds with some of the benefits you get from sun exposure. And I'll talk more about the ins and outs of this issue later in the talk. I want to back up a minute and talk a little bit about the science of vitamin D and the history of using vitamin D and sunlight for wellness. So this is a picture of Dr. Niels Reiben Finsen. He was a doctor who won the Nobel Prize in 1903 because he used sunlight with his patients to cure a form of tuberculosis. So he was sort of at the forefront of using sunlight for healing and noticing that when his patients were in the sun, they had a beneficial response and were able to overcome disease. A lot of other studies have been done since then. Hang on a sec, I just need to move this. Showing that where you live on Earth is associated with higher risk for disease. So those of us living at higher latitudes have been shown in studies to be associated with a higher risk of dying from cancer. And cancer deaths do increase with increasing distance away from the equator. And so scientists have made the connection between this and vitamin D. And they've also noted that a vitamin D deficiency, that is being medically deficient in vitamin D, where your level is too low, is associated with an increased risk of a number of different types of cancer listed here. So breast, ovarian, colon, prostate cancer, for example, are known to be associated with a vitamin D deficiency. And that's known to occur more often the further away from the equator you live. So on the flip side, scientists have found that vitamin D supplement can actually significantly reduce someone's risk for developing cancer. So the study showed a 70% reduction for all cancer risk when vitamin D supplements are used. Specifically for prostate cancer, a 50% reduction in someone's risk when they take 4,000 international units or IU of vitamin D daily. And in these studies, no negative effects of supplementation have been reported. So to take that a little bit further, those of us, I work in the field of functional medicine. And if you're at all familiar with this field, we talk a lot about some of the underlying causes for disease. And vitamin D deficiency is one of the known causes for increasing someone's risk for cancer, but also for autoimmune disease, which is often a precursor for developing cancer. And the studies have found that being born or living near the equator significantly reduces your risk for autoimmune disease. Similarly, the further away from the equator you live, the further north or the further south, then your risk for autoimmune illness is going to increase also. So all of this seems to be related to sunlight and seems to be related to vitamin D. So I want to talk a little bit about why. Why would vitamin D be so important for the immune system? And I'd like to use my kids as an analogy for this. Vitamin D is what's known as a modulator, and there's a lot of different things that modulate the immune system, and that's a good thing. You want to have a modulated immune system. If you don't have a modulated immune system, then your immune system is freaking out about little things that really don't matter. I mean, it also might freak out about big things, but it's not able to tell the difference. And that's the problem. So it's kind of like my kids. Okay, these are my kids on the left, Marion and Allison. And they're a little older than this pictured now because I've been giving this talk for a few years. But when they were younger and I left them unsupervised, they would be rambunctious. They would make a mess and not clean it up. They might get upset or carried away about something that was relatively minor or easy to address, just like a dysfunctional immune system, right? It might be reacting to an allergen and unable to come back to normal, or reacting to some small threat and unable to differentiate a small allergen from something that's very serious. What vitamin D does as a modulator is it helps my children to grow up to be moms and grandmas that then modulate or help control the behavior of the younger children or the younger immune cells. So we have these different types of immune cells. Some are more aggressive than others. And then we have other immune cells known as B cells that help kind of calm the behavior of the more aggressive cells. So you could see in the picture here, we got my kids sort of freaking out, their unmodulated immune cells. And then on the right, you see my mom, their grandma is with them. They're very well behaved. They're going to be able to recover if somebody spills a glass of milk. They're not going to fly off the handle if one of them starts irritating the other one because there's a parent present to help modulate the behavior. So vitamin D, as well as vitamin A and K and other things, are very, very important to the immune system. And if someone is struggling with a chronic disease, you need to have vitamin D there to help regulate the inflammatory response in the body, or be like a grandma and calm everything down. So scientists know that the vitamin D deficiency is linked to immune systems that are out of control or autoimmune disease. So studies have shown type 1 diabetes, MS, lupus, RA, inflammatory bowel disease. All of these things are related to the lack of modulation and a vitamin D deficiency. Vitamin D does a lot of other things for us, so I could probably talk for 3 hours about all of the things it does, but I'll try to give you a little snapshot. For our present experience with the pandemic, vitamin D is very critical to keeping our barriers to viruses strong. So vitamin D keeps the barriers in our respiratory system, the barrier between our brain and our bloodstream, the barrier in our gut. It keeps us from easily picking up pathogens. It also helps us fight viruses, and vitamin D is very important for keeping the lungs healthy. The studies have shown that vitamin D deficiencies contribute to someone developing a more severe or acute respiratory distress when they experience a viral infection, for example, and that a level of vitamin D, if you get a vitamin D test, a level below 50 will predispose someone to acute respiratory distress. And also may result in greater injuries to the lungs if they do catch a bad virus. So this is an example of a study that kind of shows these correlations between vitamin D. This set of data became available in 2020, fairly early in the pandemic, but what you can see here is that it's charting the severity of COVID cases based on someone's vitamin D. So if you look at the green are patients who had COVID-19 who had healthy levels, medically healthy levels of vitamin D. So you can see most of the green patients in the study are in the mild category, and those who developed critical or severe or even just ordinary COVID-19 reaction in terms of severity were either medically low or severely deficient in the red and the yellow. So we very much see some correlation between someone's vitamin D status and how susceptible to a bad infection of COVID they are. And then this study came out earlier this year in 2022 and showed, and it was a more controlled study about vitamin D status and someone's COVID risk and what their clinical outcome was. And so this sort of, nailed down what we saw in some of those earlier studies, showing that those people with vitamin D levels less than 20 made up 87% of severe COVID-19 cases, and they were 14 times more likely to have a severe COVID-19 outcome than somebody with a vitamin D level above 40. So apparently vitamin D is one health marker that we can definitely point to in terms of being able to predict whether or not someone's will have a severe COVID case. And conversely, we can see that people have a more positive clinical outcome when they raise their vitamin D level. So besides that, the vitamin D is very important for cardiovascular health. So we have a number of studies showing that light exposure improves people's vitamin D levels, and that helps lower blood pressure. We also see that vitamin D deficiency has been shown to increase someone's risk for heart attack by as much as 50%, and increases their risk for dying from the heart attack by 100%. So vitamin D is very, very important for the cardiovascular system. Here's just a list. Like I said, it could go on forever, but instead of doing that, here's just some examples of some of the studies done with different health problems in vitamin D. So we see a lot of issues with pregnancy for those deficient in vitamin D, issues with blood sugar control, diabetes, cardiovascular illness, mental health like schizophrenia and depression are correlated with low vitamin D, cognitive decline such as in Alzheimer's or Parkinson's, as well as epilepsy. And vitamin D deficiency was strongly associated with all causative factors for heart disease, heart attack, and death from heart attack and stroke. Here's just a few more of the medical conditions associated with lack of vitamin D. So rickets is the inability to form bones. So our bone health is very critically tied to vitamin D. Also seen things like arthritis, tendency for radiation poisoning. So there's many things, obesity, that are all correlated with low vitamin D. Just to drive this point home, of the 30 leading causes of death in our country, 19 of the 30 leading causes of death have been linked in the research to vitamin D deficiency. So this is kind of at odds with this information we get from health officials about how we're supposed to avoid the sun, right? Because if one of the main ways we would naturally make vitamin D is by going in the sun, then that's contradictory. And this is an interesting study that actually looked at the livelihood or the when people died based on whether or not they avoid the sun or they seek the sun and are very active in the sun. And what the study found was that those people who avoid the sun are much more likely to die, and they're going to die younger than people who seek out the sun. And the magnitude was equivalent to smoking in terms of life expectancy for those people who avoid the sun. So very interesting and compelling study. So why is this? Hopefully by now, I've given you enough information where you're like, wow, yeah, I agree with you. Vitamin D must be really important. Why is that? So vitamin D has to be present for some key cellular functions to occur. So basically at the cellular level in every body system, you've got to have vitamin D for the body to be optimized. So that means if your body's under stress, needs to recover from an illness, or just, needs to work optimally as you're aging, you're not going to be able to do so if you're not optimizing vitamin D. And that lack of vitamin D is just going to make you susceptible to all of the systems beginning to break down and deteriorate, opening you up for the development of disease. So here's another example. Vitamin D is very important for protecting the junctions in the gut. Leaky gut is something I talk about. I have a whole nother webinar you can watch. You can watch the recordings of these webinars, this one and the other ones I've done on my website, humannaturellc.com. So I have a whole webinar about leaky gut and how important that is for immune system health and gut health, digestive health. But anyway, we know that vitamin D helps keep the gut healthy and helps encourage healthy bacteria to continue to keep the gut healthy too. So that's another key sort of foundational thing that vitamin D is doing that helps prevent disease. Vitamin D is also very important for bone health. It promotes calcium absorption from the food we're eating and helps balance the levels of minerals in the blood so that we can mineralize our bones and promote new bone growth and remodeling of bones. So in America today, 70% of US adults are deficient in vitamin D. So this is kind of a shocking number, although maybe not if you're familiar with some of the health statistics in our nation, but that's most people walking around are deficient. And now you know that those deficiencies are connected to all of these negative health outcomes. So we might then want to talk about, how can we test people for vitamin D? How can we improve vitamin D? And in order to do that, I just wanted to preface that there's different types of vitamin D. So if you're reading about vitamin D and testing vitamin D, you need to kind of be aware that there's different units and different forms of it. So there's one form, the 25-OHD, for short, is the major circulating form. So when you're testing for vitamin D3, this is typically your blood test. There is another form that's sometimes tested called 1,25-dehydroxy, and this is the biologically active form. So, but what's a good level of vitamin D? What should we be shooting for? I showed you that there were all these problems with medical deficiencies. We have further research showing that levels below 60 seem to predispose someone to autoimmunity. Levels below 40 seem to predispose someone to osteoporosis. So what should we be shooting for? If you get a test, how do you know if your level is good or not? And I would personally say, if you really want to optimize health, the standard range that you get in your blood test is not going to help you know that you're optimizing health. So you need to be aware that there are other ranges available. That's what someone like myself as a functional medicine practitioner helps people with. So there's conflicting information out there about vitamin D, and here's what's presented. So the Vitamin D Council, which is basically made up of researchers and doctors and advocates who study vitamin D, says you need to be between 40 and 80. And they're coming more from an optimal health standpoint. The Endocrine Society, that focuses on your endocrine system, which is your glands and hormones, says you need to be between 40 and 60. The Institute of Medicine, which is what a lot of medical doctors and medical research institutes follow says you just have to be above 20, but they're saying you need to be above 20 to not have rickets, which is the disease where you can't form bones. So you know already that range is pretty conservative. Like, who would want to just barely be good enough to not be able to make bones? I mean, you really want to be optimized above that, right? But that is the range nonetheless. My field, functional medicine, usually has a higher range, and 60 to 80 is considered the optimal range among professionals like myself. And then there are some other researchers and alternative thinkers out there, like Chris Masterjohn is one who writes a lot about health, and he says 35 to 50 is optimal. And if you get above 50, you're okay, so long as you have good levels of vitamin A and K. So we'll talk a little bit about that. We can also think about what information is available to us on natural vitamin D levels, like people that don't live inside all the time, like you and me. What is an optimal level if we test people who spend a lot of time outside, like our ancestors would have? And so there's just a few studies. We really need a lot more studies, but there's a few studies. This study was done with Native African populations. So people with dark skin, living outside, not being clothed, they don't need to. And their average vitamin D level was 48. So that was their storage level. So we have that piece of information to go on. Someone living near the equator has a level of 48. We have another study stemming from St. Louis, where they looked at sunbathing lifeguards and found that their levels ranged between 50 and 80. So that was a bit higher than people living at the equator. And that's pretty much it in terms of studies we have of natural populations. So I think when we're thinking about what a good target range is, we can think about the needs of the population. So, this Native African group has more skin exposure, they're getting outside, they're getting sun every single day. They don't necessarily need a high storage level. 48 is optimal for that. Whereas here's my family camping in the Boundary Waters in the summer. It's too cold most of the day to not have clothes on, even in the summer. And the rest of the time of year, certainly you need to be covering up to protect your body, depending on the weather. We're going to need a lot more vitamin D in storage to make it through the part of the year, and just to make up for the fact that we're not at the equator getting sun every day. So that's why I would argue for a higher storage level than 48. And I think 60 to 80 is probably more appropriate of a storage level for someone in the upper Midwest. The studies show that certain levels of supplementing with vitamin D help to optimize physiological needs and help to hit some of these optimal targets found in the literature. So one study found that 6,000 international units of vitamin D daily is what was needed. Another study found a minimum of 4,800 international units is what's needed to prevent autoimmune disease. I typically suggest, well, the first thing I would do is test a level, because you have no idea where you're starting with someone. People have varying ranges of vitamin D, and it's very difficult to just look at someone and predict a vitamin D. So you really do need to test. And then once you see that your level is suboptimal or even medically low, usually I'm going to suggest people take 10,000 units daily for 2 months, and then take 5,000 units daily after that, and then testing 2 to 3 months after the initial baseline test, and see where they're at, and then adjust the dosage accordingly. Someone who is overweight or has a body mass index above 30 is often going to need 3 to 5 times as much vitamin D. So the amount of vitamin D that somebody needs is going to vary based on their size. And like I said, I just can't overemphasize the importance of testing your vitamin D level if you're wondering what you should do to optimize vitamin D. I have home testing kits available for $50. So you just order a kit, you prick your finger and do the blood sample at home and send it to the lab, and they email you the result. So it is accessible for a lot of people to do it that way. You can also ask for vitamin D test through your doctor, but I would ask for pricing information. So how much is too much vitamin D? You know, if you're going to supplement vitamin D, do we need to be worried about taking too much? Honestly, there's not a lot of good information available about this question. What I found demonstrated that perhaps people could develop some vitamin D toxicity from levels over 150. So that's pretty high level. And perhaps to reach that, you would have to take 40,000 units of vitamin D a day. So that's a lot of vitamin D. That's almost 10 times the highest recommended dose from the research I just quoted. And this is just perhaps because there's not that much published or available data in this regard. But one thing to keep in mind is that you can't, at least at this point in time, we don't think you can get toxic if you have healthy vitamin A and vitamin K levels. And this is because, like I said before, vitamin D is an enabler. It's just helping all these chemical reactions happen in your body at the cellular level. And it uses vitamin A and vitamin K to do that. So if you're getting a lot of vitamin D, like let's say you were supplementing and you were getting, more than maybe what you would normally make in the sun, so long as you have a lot of vitamin A and vitamin K, your body's just going to keep using it and optimizing that level. But if you did become deficient in vitamin A or vitamin K, then you could develop some symptoms of toxicity. Although it's my understanding from reading about these, because I've never experienced that in 15 years of practice, that the symptoms are short-lived and go away as soon as someone stops their vitamin D supplement. So we don't think there's any long-term damage done. But if you're worried about toxicity, my advice would be to use a light, because then your body will never make too much vitamin D, because your body will be totally in control of the amount of vitamin D it has. So you can use an artificial light inside your home, a UV light with eye protection to make vitamin D. And you can also have your levels of vitamins A and K checked. So as a practitioner, I can order something called a micronutrient panel that can test these levels. But there's an ideal ratio that researchers have come up with. So you can, if you're worried about your supplementing levels, you can get these tests done and measure to make sure that you're optimal and you're doing okay. And so we think also issues with vitamin D toxicity are because they're causing a vitamin A and a vitamin K deficiency. And just a plug here for vitamin K, it's actually a great vitamin, becoming popular more recently, but it's very important for our nervous system, for our lungs. It's important for bone health, protecting us from calcification of our soft tissues or the development of heart disease. And it's also very important for blood clotting. So it can be really helpful if you're going to supplement with vitamin D to take a vitamin D with K. You can also find vitamin D with vitamin A as well as K, but that's going to be a decision based on either checking your vitamin A status or thinking about how much fat soluble vitamin A is in your diet. Like, are you eating a lot of liver? Are you eating a lot of fatty fish, which would be natural sources of vitamin A, and other animal-based fat sources, which provide these fats, these vitamins, fat-soluble vitamins. So there's a range of different supplements available out there. This is just a picture of some of the ones I offer and use in my practice. So on the right is a picture of the Biotics Research Vitamin D plus K. So this is a 5,000 IU vitamin D capsule with vitamin K included. You can also get a vitamin D liquid that has the vitamins A and K in it, or you can just get a simple vitamin D drop. That's nice for kids or for people that don't want to take another capsule. You can also get vitamin D in foods like beef liver and eggs. You can see the level's fairly low. It's not the same as taking a supplement, but it will add up if these are foods that you enjoy and eat frequently. Here's another list of foods that are high in vitamin D. So you can see a lot of them are fish. And of course, for many other reasons, fish is very important for the diet. And in terms of the food you eat, whether or not you buy and consume animal foods that are from pastured or grass-fed animals will determine the nutritional level of vitamins like vitamin D. So for example, in pastured pork, 1 teaspoon of pork fat or lard has 500 units of vitamin D in it, whereas in conventional lard, it only has 13 units. So if the animal is outside and making vitamin D and living a healthy lifestyle, it's going to impart those benefits to the person, to the consumer eating the food. So there have been some studies that people are talking about that showed that vitamin D didn't have an effect, didn't show some of the health improvements we hope or thought. So I wanted to discuss this one as an example. There's a large study published in 2019, and they used vitamin D supplements. They used 2,000 units of vitamin D supplementation daily for people who are severely sick with cancer and severely sick, the highest risk rating for cardiovascular illness. And they found that supplementing with vitamin D had no effect on the health outcome for these people. So I think this is interesting. And I think there's probably a couple of reasons why we didn't see the outcome that maybe the researchers had hoped they might. First of all, from me referencing all these previous studies that the recommended dosing is a lot higher than 2,000. It's, 4,800 or 6,000 just for the average person, not even talking about the sickest people in this study. So they may just have been supplementing too low to see any beneficial effect of vitamin D in the study. Secondly, they used people in the study who were the sickest people in the population. And vitamin D is very powerful and really good for you, but there's a lot of other things happening when someone is severely sick that are broken that have to be addressed if you're really going to see the kind of miraculous outcome you're looking for, like not just vitamin D, but their blood sugar control needs to be in balance. If they have issues with toxicity, chemical or heavy metal, issues in their gut. I mean, there's all these other issues involved. So just thinking that one factor like vitamin D is going to turn everything around or start to turn things around for someone may be too ambitious. You're going to need to take a more holistic approach. And finally, I would say maybe one of the things we're learning from these studies is that it's not just about vitamin D. Maybe someone's vitamin D status is actually an indicator of something else about them. Like maybe there's things about their sun exposure that are translating to health benefits besides just vitamin D. Here's a picture of the sun lamp that I use. You can order it from Spurdy online. This is an FDA approved lamp. I don't sell this lamp. I'm not at all financially associated with the sale of this lamp. And this price is out of date. So just an FYI, but this is a lamp. I stand in front of this lamp, 5 minutes front, 5 minutes back, using eye protection to help my body make vitamin D in the winter months when we don't have any UV exposure here. And so this is kind of like, instead of taking a vitamin D supplement, which one of my mentors says is kind of like having someone do your push-ups for you. If you use a UV light, you're getting all the benefits of the UV light, not just the end product, the vitamin D. So it's a more holistic approach to getting the health benefits. So what are some of those benefits from being in the light that maybe we're missing if we just take a vitamin D supplement or we just avoid the sun? So one of the cool things about sunlight is that our skin produces beta endorphins, which are basically like opioids that help us feel good. They help balance our immune system, right? They're provide some modulating benefit, just like vitamin D. sunlight helps relieve pain, it helps promote relaxation, and it helps wounds heal faster. One of the other things that happens when we're in the sunlight is we make a beneficial nitric oxide, which is very important for the circulatory system. So you may know someone or may experience this yourself where you have very cold hands and feet, problems with circulation. That's something that's very dependent on the amount of beneficial nitric oxide you make. And being in the sun is a way we naturally boost that compound that helps with circulation, also helps with cognition, and helps with immune system and immune system recovery from inflammation. So lots of benefits from being in the sun that you can't really replicate if you're in an indoor environment, unless you use a light designed to do so. So how do we take this information about what's so beneficial about the sun and vitamin D and, mesh it with what we're hearing from these larger health organizations like the World Health Organization, the American Cancer Society, the Surgeon General, who are all telling us avoid a lot of sun and use sunscreen when you go outside? Because I just told you, if you're using sunscreen and you're avoiding the sun, then that is correlated with all of these health problems and death even. And so I think slowly things are actually changing in terms of the recommendations for sunlight. Here was a study that was published just a few years ago where they looked again at malignant melanoma and people's sun exposure, and they actually found that your UV exposure does not at all play a role in developing melanoma. And that this whole idea of getting sunburnt would increase your risk actually doesn't play out when you look at bigger studies. So some compelling information, and looking at the details in the study, I thought one thing that caught my eye was that a lot of the recommendations for staying out of the sun aren't actually based on studies of the sun. They're based on studies of extremely high levels of artificial light inside in labs. And so what they thought is causing cancer inside in labs using artificial light is not actually translating to what is actually happening when people are in the sun. So I think we still need to stay tuned while researchers continue to sort of flesh this out and work out some of the biases that have been implicated in telling us to slather on sunscreen and stay out of the sun, because clearly there's growing evidence that says contrary. So I would just follow that thought by adding, if you're someone who does have very high risk, health risk to be in the sun, that's an important conversation to be having with your doctor. I don't mean to be saying things that, contradict a conversation you'd have with your doctor for the very small part of the population that could be at risk from sun exposure. But I think for the majority of people, more sunlight is only going to equate to benefits. So the last thing I'm going to talk about is about red light and blue light. Red light is a part of the solar spectrum or the sunlight spectrum that we get when we're outside. And besides the UV light, that's so important for all the reasons I just mentioned, the vitamin D, the nitric oxide, the natural opioids, but the red light is the other very important piece of the spectrum that we have growing evidence and the most evidence that we get the health benefits from. So I wanted to focus on those two because you can replicate those two forms of light inside in the indoor environment during the winter. So this is a study that looked, for example, at red light and thyroid hormone. So when we're outside, our body is responding to the different spectrums of light. The red light is strongest at sunrise and at sunset, and it appears that we make thyroid hormone in response to the red light. What I have here on the screen was from a study where they took thyroid participants who had Hashimoto's autoimmune thyroiditis, And they actually found in using the red light that the majority of the participants were able to get off of their thyroid medication just using the red light to stimulate the thyroid to perform again. So this isn't something you should do at home without guidance, but just a really cool demonstration of how natural light can help your body to heal and recover, and help recover your metabolism. The other gland that responds to the light, besides the thyroid, is the adrenal glands. And the adrenal glands are glands that respond to stress. So they make all of our stress hormones, and they're a secondary production site of our sexual hormones too. So particularly later in life, as women are going through menopause and men are transitioning into andropause and seeing a decline, the adrenal glands in the production of hormones become very, very important. So anyway, adrenal glands are making cortisol, which is our main stress hormone, and they regulate our circadian rhythm throughout the day. So, for example, people that have depression or anxiety, clinical depression and clinical anxiety, have been shown to have adrenal dysregulation or dysregulation of the hormone cortisol. And what we're finding is that the regulation of cortisol all goes back to light exposure. I mean, yes, there are other things involved, like obviously stress and how you're eating and you're sleeping. But one of the really powerful things you can do to help regulate stress hormones is get more light, especially if you're someone who is very fatigued or depressed, or just dysregulated in your stress hormone levels. And finally, melatonin is the last hormone I want to talk about. It is our key hormone that we make in response to the light, and it is critical. It protects your mitochondrial DNA. That means that it protects your cellular ability to stay healthy. And it controls inflammation. It controls the turnover of a lot of different chemical processes in the cell. And it's the melatonin that signals when a cell needs to die. So if someone is developing cancer, for example, and they had adequate melatonin levels, then what we're finding is that the melatonin would signal the apoptosis or autophagy process of digesting the sick cell. Someone with low levels of melatonin, however, may not be able to stop those cancer cells from dividing and developing into something more insidious or a tumor. So melatonin is also very important for developing dopamine, serotonin. These are important neurotransmitters that affect pleasure and reward and well-being. Adrenaline, histamine, all of these compounds are built in response to the sunlight. So the big problem is that in our modern lifestyle, we're inside all the time. We're sort of become these creatures of comfort. We need our air conditioning. We need our we need our heated home. And I'll digress if I go too far, but we've created this indoor environment, and we have windows between us and the sun. So we're not getting the natural light that our bodies really need to naturally balance our chemistry and help optimize health. Finally, without melatonin, you just can't sleep properly either. So it's very, very important for sleep. So just bear with me. I just have a couple more slides here and want to show you a couple of cool things about melatonin. But you might remember from high school biology class that the mitochondria is a little orange organelle here that produces the energy. So it produces ATP, which is our main source of energy. And so if you've got melatonin, then you're promoting energy production, and you're promoting, like I said, the ability to kill cells that are sick or unhealthy, to communicate between different tissues, and basically prevent disease. And this is an excerpt from a study where scientists use melatonin to reverse the aging process and stop diseases from developing. So, I'm not making this stuff up. This is, if you're in an optimized light environment, that is completely free, you have the power to control your health outcome. So don't underestimate the ability of light to help. Most of us here in front of the computer, like we are today, are getting too much blue light, and that has a negative effect on melatonin. So scientists show that lots of artificial blue light, so blue light from our computer screen, from our TV, from our telephone, from our lights, from being in a fluorescent light at a store, all of these suppress melatonin. So they're going to make you not sleep as well. They're going to make you predisposed to gain weight, to developing insulin resistance. So all of these things happen in kind of this artificial environment that we've all gotten used to. So you need to take some steps to reduce your blue light exposure and increase your natural sunlight, or at least try to mimic some of the most beneficial aspects of natural sunlight if you're indoors in the winter. If you live near the equator and you're listening to this, then you kind of got it made, because you can just go outside and spend most of your time outside and you're kind of done. So here's an example of some of the ways you can be proactive to help support melatonin production innately, which is just so powerful for your health. So on your phone, you can look under the settings, and there's blue blocker applications, or sometimes it'll say night setting. So that helps block the blue light. You can do the same thing on a laptop. You can also get blue blocker glasses, which is what I'm wearing here in the picture. And if you don't have a prescription, you can get just plain blue blocker without a prescription and wear those at night when you're surrounded by artificial light that's depressing the melatonin production, because you want to do what you can to boost melatonin, not suppress it. You can also use incandescent light bulbs at home, or light bulbs that have more red in them and less blue spectrum. And like I said, just go outside. So I became familiar with this group, 1,000 Hours Outside. There's a local Madison group. And I did this a few years ago, where I logged all the hours every day that I went outside. And you have to average 2 to 3 hours a day to get 1,000 hours outside. But this is just an example of, a way you could improve your sunlight exposure. It's completely free. And, you're just tracking, and just that process of tracking hours, whether or not you get to 1,000 or 500 or 10,000, whatever it is, it's just something that helps you be better, and helps you continue to work on incorporating more outside time and sun exposure into your life. You can also get a red light for as little as $10, and this will create the near infrared and red spectrum that I was talking about, is the other part of the sunlight that's so beneficial. You can use this lamp for pain relief. You can use it to help balance your circadian rhythm and your cortisol levels, boost thyroid hormone, boost melatonin and mitochondrial activity. So it's a great thing for any household. Here's a picture of my setup. I have like a far infrared mat. It's like a sauna mat called a biomat. And then I have a near infrared lamp above, and I just lie on that and read in the wintertime most evenings, to try to make up for the lack of sun exposure that I'm not getting here in Wisconsin. And I do try to go outside as frequently as I can in the winter too, but it's just not the same, as you know, as sitting outside like in the summer. So the key takeaways are, vitamin D is not just beneficial. The research is showing it's really critical for health. And it's harder to make the further away from the equator you are. So if you don't live at the equator, you probably need to do something proactive to boost your vitamin D levels. And there are benefits to being in the sun that exceed just vitamin D. So it's important to be thinking about that. Supplementing for vitamin D can be helpful, but using a light is really optimal. And I recommend using a UV light as well as a near infrared light if you do live far away from the equator. Final plug here that I do one-on-one individual sessions through the co-op. Right now I'm scheduling these sessions for February, so they do fill up in advance because there's just a few of them available every month. But I am booking those up, so if you're interested, you can contact me. And then I hope to see you next month when I'm talking about sleep, and the month after that when I'm talking about blood pressure in February.